Hi, everyone. I'm Gary Brode from Deep Knowledge Investing. We help sophisticated investors earn better returns in the equity portion, the public equity portion of their portfolios. Today, we're very excited to be here with recently retired Lieutenant Colonel Jason Galui. Jason is a West Point graduate, played goalie on the hockey team there, is a combat veteran with multiple tours of duty in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's a two-time assistant professor of economics at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He has been called to serve in the White House on 3 separate occasions, I believe. Jason was a member of the National Security Council and a special advisor in the Oval Office to President Obama. And then again, the National Security Council, a special advisor in the Oval Office to President Trump. Jason is one of the few people who has been in the White House with Vice President Biden and President Trump. He has known both men personally and worked with them professionally. After leaving the Army with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel, Jason went to the Cox School of Business at Southern Methodist University, and he's the founder and CEO of Liberty Consulting LLC. Jason is also a member of the Deep Knowledge Investing Board of Advisors. Jason, first, thank you for being here. We're thrilled to have you. Thank you for being on the board of Deep Knowledge Investing. And most importantly, thank you for your 2 decades of service to the United States. We really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gary. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. And thanks for all of you joining and for your precious time, especially.
All right, so we're just going to jump right in here. Obviously, people are very focused on the election next week. As noted, you're one of the few people who knows both men running for president personally, has worked with both of them in the Oval Office. We just want to point out a couple of things to people on this call. One, please be aware this is being recorded. If you're not comfortable with that, you can disconnect. If any of you have questions, feel free to use the messaging system, send the questions to Shay, he'll forward them to me. We also want to emphasize this is a nonpartisan call. Our goal is only to inform and bring as much information to people who are interested in this as possible. We are not cheerleading for one side or the other. Jason has ably served both Democratic and Republican presidents. He's served in multiple administrations. We are really just trying to provide information. With that in mind, Jason, we know better than to ask you who you're voting for, but most importantly, who do you think is going to win?
Yeah, I mean, everyone wants predictions, and predictions are pretty costless and fall in the bucket of cheap talk as far as I'm concerned. So I think what I'll do is I'll offer who I think will win and then what I hope the outcome is for the sake of the country and go from there. But to reiterate what you said, I do value very much my service as a nonpartisan, unaffiliated public servant, and I do not take lightly the experiences and observations I was able to have in 2 very different White Houses. As you mentioned, Gary, I spent about 2.5 years in the Obama administration at the NSC, and spent 1.5 years with the Trump administration, both in the transition on the NSC, through the transition in the West Wing from General Flynn to General McMaster. I then returned to the White House in 2019 as a senior advisor at the Council of Economic Advisors. I only left there in August. So I have a number of perspectives and observations. And what I share today is really, these are my observations as an Army officer serving in the White House, as a student of history, and really as an American citizen. I really felt fortunate to be in the Oval Office with these 2 very different men, and then getting to see Vice President Biden in the office too. And so I have a different perspective and really more human. So I hope through today's talk, I can bring some of the human element of what it's like to be in that chair behind the Resolute desk. But in terms of what I think will happen next week, I'm gonna go back to 2016 for a moment, only because I watched the 2016 election from the Roosevelt Room, and it felt very much at the time like it was set up as if it was a Super Bowl party. As a New England Patriot fan, it reminded me of the 2007 Super Bowl, when the expectation was that New England would win the Super Bowl, set the record 19-0, and all of this historic event, and it didn't play out, especially after that Tyree catch to the head. But it felt very similar in 2016 on that Tuesday. And I left that night, my prediction that night when I left at around midnight was that we would wake up to a Hillary Clinton projected winner with contested results rivaling the Bush-Gore 2000 campaign. That morning, I woke up to President-elect Donald Trump and was very fortunate as I nudged my wife, said, I get to go to the White House today. I get to go and begin the process of transition, this peaceful transition of power. And so I say that because my prediction that night on election night, perhaps biased by being surrounded by the Obama team, was wrong. So very likely to be wrong today. But my prediction, for what it's worth, it's costless, so it's easy for me to throw it out there, even though we're being recorded, is that I think Vice President Biden wins a close election. And the reason I say that, if you asked me a week ago, maybe I would have been flip-flopped. I think the voter turnout is really perhaps a sign of perhaps some dissatisfaction with the current administration, in particular, maybe the style of President Trump. So that's what I think will happen, is that it'll be a close victory by Vice President Biden, perhaps most likely contested in various places. What I hope happens, and this is where my nonpartisan, my love of the country comes before all, and that's whoever wins, whether it's a second Trump administration or a first Biden administration. My hope for the sake of the country is that it's a landslide, clear outcome in either way. I think that is the best outcome for our country, is that it's a clear victory and the losing side has no choice but to concede, and we can move on. And otherwise, our institutions, our democratic institutions, are being undermined from both sides, right? Questioning the validity of votes, questioning the contested afterwards. And I just think that plays into our adversaries' hands, and it puts at risk this experiment that is America.
It's a great point, Jason. You shared with me before some comments made that next morning when you walked in the White House after the Trump win, and a senior member of the Obama administration made what I thought was a significant statement. Are you comfortable sharing that on this call?
Absolutely. I mean, she has shared it in her book, so happy to do so. So the senior Obama official that Gary is referencing is Ambassador Susan Rice, for whom I worked when she was National Security Advisor. And the morning after that 2016 election, I was fortunate enough to be in the White House Situation Room at a meeting of the National Security Council staff, senior directors, and Ambassador Rice came in after meeting with the president that morning, and we waited for Secretary Clinton to give her concession speech. And Ambassador Rice came in, sat down at the head of that table, and looked at all of us and said, for those of you in this room for whom this is your first significant political loss, welcome to a democracy. This is how it works. She went on to say that for the next 72 days or so, we are responsible for the security of the United States and the safety of the American people. That is non-negotiable. Second, we will effect the most professional and complete transition of power that this country has ever seen. She said that President Bush was very good to President Obama, and President Obama wanted to exceed even that standard. And the last thing she said was that most folks in the room were going to experience a range of emotions over the coming days, weeks, and months, and that we needed to take care of each other as we move towards January 20th. And for me, looking around the room, recognize that myself and one other person in that room that day were going to be the only ones there on January 21st to welcome the new team. And I took that on as a military officer, being through a number of changes of command. I was at the ultimate change of command between commanders in chief, and I was able to, I think, maintain my professionalism while a lot of people around me were visibly upset. I knew that the country continues regardless of who the president is.
Obviously, her comments, I think, reflect well on the Obama administration. I also think it was kind and gracious of her to acknowledge that the Bush administration did a great job during the handover. Certainly gracious of her to acknowledge that.
And President Obama said that to the team as we prepare for transition. He said the Bush team was, this is before we knew the outcome, the Bush team was very good to him, and that hasn't always been the case from what I understand, but that was the standard we were aiming for, was the Bush standard.
That's phenomenal. So Jason, let's talk about that. Your prediction is for a close election, potentially likely contested. We at Deep Knowledge Investing see that as unfortunately a likely outcome as well. We agree with you. It would certainly be better for the country that we have a situation where half the country doesn't feel like they basically got screwed, to use the indelicate term on it. What do you think the odds are that the country does manage to negotiate a peaceful transition, whether that's a continuation of the Trump presidency and the Biden people graciously conceding defeat, or should it go the other way, having a peaceful transition of power from an outgoing Trump administration to an incoming Biden administration?
Well, I think a peaceful transition of power in whichever direction is a must. It is an imperative for our country. That is one thing that truly makes America great, is that we, through 2.5 centuries almost, have had this peaceful transition of power, really set forth by President Washington walking away from power. And that is really, I think, the quintessential element here, is that if you are truly a public servant, at some point you recognize that your influence and your power is to be absolute power corrupts absolutely. I think a failure of either side to concede, even if it's so contested, is this might be somewhat provocative, but I think would approach a failure to concede, even a closely contested election. If we're working legal schemes to figure out which ballots count, which ones don't, well, then one side needs to truly be a public servant and help lead the country. Otherwise, I might think of the officer where we're on the lookout for domestic enemies of the Constitution. And that's, I only say that to be somewhat provocative, but Civil War, when there was intense killing on both sides of our country, and after Appomattox and the unconditional surrender by the South to the North, General Lee told the Confederate soldiers to go home. It's now time to rebuild. They could have run an insurgency and continued to undermine the country, but they didn't. It took leadership, special leaders to do that. And I think we need that at this time. And it is my hope, again, that our national level leaders should be the preferred outcome on both sides. And I just.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Sorry, we had some technical difficulties. We're back with Lieutenant Colonel Jason Galui to continue discussing the election. Sorry that the people who were on got bounced off. Jason, the topic we were talking about is a peaceful transition of power. There have been fears on both sides that the other side won't concede. The thing we were talking about before, President Trump has been cagey in talking about the circumstances where he would voluntarily leave the White House. There are senior people on the Democratic side. We acknowledge not former Vice President Biden, but some senior people on the Democratic side have said that he should not concede the election under any circumstances. And so there are fears on both sides that we could have an election result that's close, that half the country won't acknowledge, and the apparent loser will claim foul play and not concede the election. Under what circumstances do you think either of these men, for the good of the country, says, okay, we lost this one, let's do better in 4 years?
Well, I think it's a must that one of these two sides has to concede for the safety and the sake of our democracy. The conditions under which I think they would do so, one side or the other, would be certainly in a landslide victory, either direction. And then it's hard to think about, given the rhetoric on both sides, and it's my hope that the rhetoric we've heard on both sides, the caginess, as you described, President Trump's comments, and some of the former Vice President Biden's senior aides saying that he wouldn't concede under any conditions. my hope is that that's just rhetoric to their respective bases, and that when it comes down to it, that both gentlemen, as leaders, recognize that the country is bigger than either one of them, and that it will be in the best interest of the country. And if they are true public servants, they will concede instead of playing. Either one would concede instead of playing some legal games. Which is, I'm not a lawyer, so forgive me for calling them legal games, but when you're trying to really dial down on some of the rules of the game, I think that's not healthy necessary for the democracy. And then also the conditions under which one side or the other would and should concede. It won't be obvious to the public, but it is what our adversaries' goals might be, and that is to undermine our way of life. And whether if you're an advisor to Xi Jinping, you are trying to help to show the world that the American way of life has run its course and that the Chinese way is better. If you're advising in the Kremlin to Vladimir Putin, you want to undermine our democracy and foment continued dissent between the two potential next U.S. presidents as a way to continue to bring down the United States and thus increasing the relative power of Russia, just to name two of our adversaries out there. So I think that's if we don't get a landslide outcome, then recognizing that not conceding plays into to the hands of our adversaries is important.
Okay, that's a great point. Jason, I want to go to the more personal side of things. Earlier in this discussion, you talked about, instead of the institution of the presidency, you talked about the human people sitting in that chair behind the resolute desk, that these are human beings. There are some difficult allegations being lobbed on both sides. I'd like to talk about both of them. We'll talk about the issues on both sides. I know you've known former Vice President Biden for the better part of the last decade or so. There are allegations that he is suffering from cognitive decline, some sort of age-related dementia or lack of ability to process. Is that something that you've seen?
So my interactions with Joe Biden when he was the vice president really was late 2014 to January 2017. So that limited space, and I haven't interacted with him since. So given my observations, and again, as I said at the beginning, these are my individual observations as an American citizen and as a student of history and as a military officer in these rooms. Vice President Biden always had something thoughtful, logical to say in whatever the foreign policy discussion was. Personally, do I always agree with everyone and what their direction is? No, but he is the duly elected leader. And I have never in any of my instances in the Oval Office or in the Situation Room with Vice President Biden ever found myself questioning where his incentives lie or what his goals were. And to me, it was always trying to help the president make the best decisions for the country, given his particular set of preferences.
Have you noticed, and I realize you're not in personal contact with him right now, in the same room with him, but it's been, like you said, 3 to 6 years since you were working directly with him. Have you seen any evidence of cognitive decline since then? He's had some difficulties at times speaking on stage. Do you think that's evidence of something, or is it simply a matter of if you give 20 speeches a day and somebody's filming it all, that you can always make a blooper reel?
My sense is it's more the latter, and giving multiple speeches a day. There were times at West Point where I taught 3 of the same lessons in a row, and by the time I got to lesson 3, which was just 2 hours later, I couldn't remember if I had told that group of cadets the same thing from earlier, or had I covered it. I always remembered who the cadets were in the room. But when I look at Vice President Biden on stage, or and really anyone on stage, I try to put myself in their shoes and think, okay, how would I be there under the lights, under the scrutiny? To bring this back to the human side, the job for which these 2 gentlemen are interviewing is the most scrutinized job on the planet. And you're going to be the busiest person on the planet, handling the most complex issues those issues have no good solutions. You're choosing from a range of least bad options with pressure coming at you from all angles. And no matter what you do, 50% of the country and a large portion of the world is going to disagree with you. And so that's just a lot of pressure on anybody. So when any candidate makes a gaffe on stage or anywhere, I tend on the human side, to, especially after seeing them in person, operating, how exhausting the job is, recognizing their age as well. They're both in their, like, I don't know, mid to late 70s, and and if I were that age, I don't think I would be doing any of that in what they're doing, and it's tough. I mean, so is that examples of cognitive decline? I don't know. I'm not medical professional, but having said that, I personally do think that, I mean, that generation, in my opinion, should hand over the power to the next generation. I think that the 50s and 60s people in that space is where perhaps our best leaders are.
That's an interesting point, and one that we're starting to hear from other people as well. Let's make sure we talk about the other side as well. There are allegations from the Biden camp, from the political left, that President Trump isn't really serious about the job, that he's not really fully engaged or equipped to handle that chair behind the resolute desk. Is that what you've seen?
So I'll go back to probably week 2 or 3 of this administration. And I believe General Flynn was there. So that gives me a good timestamp as to when this happened. But I do recall a moment near the end of the day in the Oval Office where I was in there, and a relatively large group of presidential aides were there. And my memory is such that the president looked right at me at some point, because he knew I was one of the Obama holdovers that they trusted, that the new team trusted. And he looked at me and said something to the effect of, "Is it always like this here?" I mean, it was an exhausting day. It was late in the afternoon, and he looked visibly tired, as anybody would at the end of a long day at the office and dealing with issues that you'd rather probably not deal with, but you have to because of your role. And I looked up and smiled and said, "Yes, Mr. President, welcome to the White House. If you haven't realized it yet, your job kind of sucks." And he chuckled, and I remember others in the room who perhaps people don't see them smile on TV. Everyone chuckled, and it was a few days later, or perhaps a week later, where he did an interview, I think, with Bloomberg, where he referenced that the job was much more challenging, much harder than he thought it was going to be. The job is relentless. So in terms of the, specific to your question as to whether or not he is serious about the job, I can't imagine how anyone is not serious about the job. Once you start getting the information and start realizing the gravity of that desk and what the decisions that you make, or the recommendations that are brought to you, recognizing that the decisions you make will affect billions of human beings. I mean, I can't imagine someone not taking it seriously. Whether or not he wanted the job initially, and when he came down that escalator, that's I think only he and a few select folks really know. But I think he takes this very seriously. I think the question we should be asking ourselves, really, as we think about the two gentlemen interviewing for this job, is how they make decisions. Because like I said, their decisions are very consequential for the planet. And President Trump is very instinctive in nature. He relies more on his gut and what that tells him. A Vice President Biden would rely more on trusted advisors and more of a deliberative discussion. So I think it's really a decision-making style that I think would be to me, I would wish people were talking about more, and which decision-making style is better for the country at this point in time. And then you talk about those then who will surround the president and help him make those decisions. So that's a real conversation I think is better than some of these other, who's more corrupt and who's going to block this. And to me, I don't say it's noise because it's important, but I think we lose focus on what the job of the president really is.
So you just brought up issues of corruption. There has been a ton of news in the last week regarding the Hunter Biden laptop. The allegation is that the vice president's son was selling access and potentially access to U.S. foreign policy, and that enemy governments had compromising material on both Hunter Biden and at the time Vice President Biden, and that they still have this compromising material. So you have issues of corruption and potential blackmail. Have you seen any evidence of that? Do you think that's credible?
So I've seen no evidence beyond what various outlets are reporting. I've seen nothing official. I wouldn't, even in the jobs I had, I would not have seen anything, any official reporting. And again, not to discount the importance of the allegations, though in my job as a deputy executive secretary of the National Security Council or as a senior advisor for national security at the Council of Economic Advisors, that, to me, that those discussions on either side is what I would put in the category of noise. And I often would say, in fact, I wrote on my whiteboard in my first tour of the White House, ignore the noise, do your job, because that is for others to debate and argue. My job is to support the duly elected president of the United States, whoever that person is, and perform the job so long as it's legal and not putting anybody in grave danger. I will say, in terms of the Bidens and Ukraine, I recall being in the Oval Office when President Obama talked to the president of Ukraine back in their administration and Vice President Biden in the room, and the follow-on discussions. As I said earlier, there was never, to me, any sense that there was any extraordinary reason why Vice President Biden was in there. I'd seen him in there on other calls to Iraq and Syria, and to Russia, so it wasn't unusual. Now, I would say, whether you are, I think any person running for president, there's going to be a lot of digging, like we would expect on their opposition party from adversaries, and so a lot can be thrown out there, and it's really incumbent upon us as American citizens to think through the information that's out there and where we're getting that information from, and the various sources and methods by which it comes to us, and think through it rather than believing it all at face value. And it's very hard to do in this day and age, but we have to find a way to hold on to the truth and accuracy.
Now, on that topic, there also have been allegations of corruption on the Trump side of things as well. Do you see that the same way as noise, or do you think there's something more significant there?
Again, if I'm just looking at it from the perspective of my roles, then I would say that's noise, and we do our job. I did support the president in helping the process by which he makes decisions that are very consequential to our country. The allegations that fly around corruption, again, that's not for me, that's for law enforcement, intelligence analysts, whoever it might be that is following those trails to determine. And if the process leads to a president being removed, as we almost saw earlier this year, or allegations against a candidate like we see with Vice President Biden, then that's, as a public servant, I continue to serve. My oath remains to the Constitution, not to any party or any person.
Okay, Jason, let's move on from some of the personalities and just talk about regular Americans. I think there are a lot of fears on both sides of pre or post-election civilian violence. What do you think the probability of that is, especially in, I think, the likely event that we do not have a landslide, that there really is a contested election, or a sense that it was close enough that half the country believes that it wasn't fair, that the other side got it by cheating? What happens there?
Yeah, I think if you asked me this question a year or two ago, or even a year ago, I'd say the likelihood of civilian violence or civilian unrest after a U.S. election was unlikely. That I've seen this in Iraq and Afghanistan. I'm not going to see it in the streets of Boston, Chicago, whatever you take, pick your city, Philadelphia. But I think it's likely, and I think it's likely to, very likely, especially the closer the election and the more contested it is, the more likely the probability goes up in my mind. And I think we're already seeing it in cities around the country at polling sites. I got a note from someone I know working some polls in Pennsylvania, and it said for the first time in his life, he's worked polls for years. He has a handgun not far from him because he's seen it. He has seen the two sides getting very close to each other, and I think it's very emotional. I think that's where we need national leadership, and it's really, I'd say, Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And I don't use their titles here intentionally, because as national leaders, they need to recognize what their rhetoric will do. Whether you're, President Trump and questioning already the results of an election, or you're Vice President Biden and you're saying this is about the soul of America. Both sides are going after the very deep emotional states, and we are a very fragile society right now with all that's happened in 2020. And I think there's plenty of opportunities for our civilians to go at one another, which then leads to opportunities for foreign adversaries to exploit that opportunity, whether it's to fund Antifa elements on the left, or fund right-wing extremists on the right, or just themselves to throw some fuel on the fire to keep America to destabilize us in ways that, again, questions whether or not our form of democracy, our way of life, has run its course. And so we can't do our foreign adversaries bidding for them. And I wish there was a way to convey to the American people broadly we have to be, one team, one fight with what's going on around the world, but our domestic politics is just so, we've polarized ourselves, and it's been exacerbated by our adversaries, that it's going to be challenging times, and it's going to require real national leadership to move us through the 79 days that followed November 3rd.
So on that, Jason, you were just talking about foreign funding for Antifa. There has been widespread violence over the last 3-4 months where they have been part of that. And I'm not suggesting they're the only part of it. But if civilian violence is being funded in an organized way by foreign governments, do you think there's anything we can or should do to punish these foreign actors? What should we be doing to stop them from funding domestic unrest?
So I think, first and foremost, it's the President of the United States whose primary job is the security of the American people, the security of our civilization, should be calling these foreign heads of state, Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, especially, and telling and giving them very clear guidance to stay out of our domestic issues, and to reveal to them potential credible threats of what we could do in response if we determine that they have either interfered in our elections, or in the context of what we're discussing now, foment continued civil unrest on our shores. And so whether that be, we could put visible sign, when I say credible threats, we can move military assets in and around borders. Now, if we do so, it must be credible, and we have to be willing to exercise military force and punish if it happens. And there are various forms of punishment we can do from a military perspective. But if we do that, then you have to be willing to follow, you're risking escalation from there. You could also do, there are economic measures you could take, whether they be in the form of sanctions or other restrictions on movement of capital around the globe that you could put on some of these countries. So there are things we can do, but at first it takes a very clear message from the president, the commander in chief, whose primary job is to provide the security of the civilization, to give to these adversarial heads of state to stay out of our business.
Okay, you were actually just talking about the U.S. military. In the circumstance that we're talking about, where we have a tight contested election and some sort of civilian civic unrest and violence, do you think there are circumstances where the police are overwhelmed and the United States military gets involved?
Are there circumstances in which the police get overwhelmed, the U.S. military gets involved? No. I hope, again, I'll start by saying I hope. Now, the National Guard getting involved, I mean, that's up to a local governor to decide how do they use the National Guard. But to use the United States Armed Forces under the direction of the U.S. Northern Command commander, given that combatant commander operational control or giving him a mission to quell violence in the United States, I think no. Again, I think maybe this is a hope. If I find and the fact that I find myself questioning my own hope is I think should be at least for me, it's a signal that we're not a healthy country right now in many ways, literally and figuratively. But General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, has come out and said the U.S. military would have no role in a post-election stability operation in the United States. Those are my words, not his, but essentially that's what we would be doing. And I would have confidence in our police that our police would not be overwhelmed. And if they are, then there is the National Guard that can come and provide some additional support, or other federal law enforcement entities that would come in, again, as public servants to maintain peace and order, rather than supporting any particular candidate. And I think that's where we'd have to be aware of the candidates conflating law enforcement support for peace and order more so than support for them, if that makes sense.
It does, and we also agree with you that deployment of active duty U.S. military on American soil would be a disaster and a last resort. Really, just not good for the country in any way. Not good for the military, not good for the people. So, we're hoping that doesn't happen as well. You've been talking about foreign actors. There's no question that the Trump administration has brought a very different approach to our relationship with China, certainly a slightly different approach to our relationship with Russia. Do you think that continues or changes under a continued Trump administration or a new Biden administration? What happens to our foreign policy regarding China and Russia?
I think the trajectory that the Trump administration has put our foreign policy on, especially with respect to Russia and China, certainly continues in the Trump administration, a second Trump administration. And I think the momentum is there to continue in a Biden administration. I think the Trump administration and President Trump himself and some of his close advisors have shined a light on a lot of these practices that China in particular has been employing. There was President Trump has revealed that the underlying assumption on China entering the WTO and agreed to by President Clinton and then entered into under President Bush in 2002, that if China enters, that liberal economic theory says you bring them into this order, they're going to fall in line and they'll realize that it's in their best interest to cooperate. President Trump's administration has shown that that's not the case, that we have revealed what Xi Jinping is really trying to do. And even so much so that the Chinese Communist Party has come out and described that their pursuit of a common destiny for all mankind by 2050 is a goal, and that they have three ways to approach that. One is achieving Made in China 2025, their advancement in or their desire to seek global leadership across 10 strategic industries by the middle of this decade is one avenue. Their Belt and Road Initiative, originally called One Belt, One Road, is symbolic of trying to co-opt, co-opt countries around the world and to use their economic leverage over countries. And then the third element to their really what their overall strategy is to the promotion of civil military fusion, where you get civilian technology and you fuse it together to increase your military. I think China's ultimate goal is to collapse the free and open rules-based order that the United States and our allies put together after World War II, because they have a different way of viewing it. And the Chinese Communist Party has learned from the Soviet Union that they see that in order to maintain economic growth under a state controlled economy, as under a command economy, they need to achieve technology. They need to increase their technology, and not just the computers and gadgets, but the pure economic sense of technology, where it's better use of your capital and labor and your inputs to get greater output. And that's why, excuse me, that's why they are pursuing stealing technology, whether that be through companies that want to do business in China, they have to hand over intellectual property, or exploiting our research institutions here in our country, using our openness against us. Likewise, Russia, pursuing that same goal of collapsing the free and open rules-based order that the United States and our allies put in place after World War II. Russia tends to, and I think maybe Vladimir Putin in particular, has for more than 2 decades, has sought to bring others down rather than bringing Russia up. And so by exploiting our own polarization, by exploiting our own gaps in how we transmit information now through social media and other areas, he and his intelligence services have been able to bring us down a bit, thus rising up the relative power of Russia, ultimately trying to get Russia back to global superpower. And so I think this, long story short, this return, as they say, to great power competition is here, and it remains under either a Biden or a Trump administration.
Okay. It's interesting to think that as much as President Trump has changed the direction of U.S. foreign policy, that even in a different administration, a Biden administration might actually follow the same course of action. That's a really interesting observation.
And perhaps, history will look back at a Trump administration and see a number of things, a lot of positives coming out of it, despite where some people feel like we're kind of in this crazy space. But maybe it's people are more engaged now, which could be for the better if we do it the right way and don't resort to violence.
Right.
President Trump has really questioned the post-Cold War foreign policy of the United States, which, we can look back and point to perhaps failures of our foreign policy in various areas around the world. There are a lot of positives too. So I think perhaps as I think about history looking back, again, just my thoughts, where this period of time, whether it's 4 years or 8 years, is really some self-reflection of our country and how we engage in the world. And I think he has shown that a number of the assumptions out of post-Cold War, post-9/11 have proven to not be valid, and thus has reoriented our foreign policy.
Right. Some of the long-term expert approaches maybe warranted some rethinking, and that was an area where he was effective in rethinking maybe our approach to some of those things.
Yes. Yeah. We always, as a strategist, we always should be relooking our assumptions and rethinking if our approach is still valid. And I think we got a bit complacent through multiple administrations, and we either became too hopeful in people's behaviors, or thought that we could shape others' behaviors very easily. To me, an Obama administration is more hopeful, and the Bush administration, for example, was hopeful in the sense that we could go shape others' behaviors. Right.
Yeah, agreed. That was not necessarily a partisan observation. That's been going on for decades. Yeah. Let's get to our last 2 questions, Jason. There have been serious allegations of cheating on both sides. On the Democratic side, there's been a lot of focus on the Transition Integrity Project, which where they've talked about stuffing the ballot boxes, creating black flag operations, not conceding even if they lose, and potentially using Democratic governors to send a second set of electors to the Electoral College, all of which would violate the Constitution. On the Republican side, there have been allegations and questions about limiting pre-election ballot boxes, about allegations that they're intentionally slowing down the mail service, where the accusation is that the early mail-in voting will favor the Democrats, and so the Republicans are trying to put barriers to that voting in place. Do you have any thoughts on any of that? How much of this do you think is really going on? How honest do you think this election will be? Again, accusations being made on both sides.
Yeah. So again, my thoughts only. So take them for what they're worth. I think, our democracy depends on the ability of people to exercise their right to vote. And in any actions that seek to restrict anybody's right to vote, in my growing opinion, now that I think about this more so after being out of the Army, is that restricting anybody's right to vote, I think, presents someone as a domestic enemy to the Constitution. I can't, and it's been the story here in Texas a little bit, where one ballot box for mail-in drop-ins in per county, that seems a little unreasonable to me as an American citizen, because some counties here are quite large and that it would require people driving hours to go drop in their ballot. Now, on the one hand, I can say, well, voting, if it's the most important civic duty, then anyone should be willing to drive 3 or 4 hours. But that's also costly from an economic perspective, because those people are taking time off from work and there's lost productivity and so yada, yada, yada. So I think those are inappropriate ways we're reducing if we're increasing the cost of someone to voting, we're thus making it harder to do so. And I think we should be doing the opposite, making it easier for people to vote. And if I'm a Republican and I fear that, well, then instead of playing around with people's abilities to vote, perhaps much like President Trump has forced us to relook our foreign policy, relook what we are as a party. If we are a Republican, if I'm a Democrat, and I would do the same thing. If we allow everyone to vote, is pretty with minimizing the barriers. And I think that's perhaps the role of the government, should be minimizing barriers to voting. And whatever the outcomes are, we accept them and then do some reflection. If you're on the losing side, understand why you lost instead of playing around with some of the rules of the game. And that makes me think, I just use the term game. One of my concerns, again, as a transitioning military officer, paying far more attention domestically than I have in my life, and that could be, I could be guilty of, it could be a sin on my part as a citizen. I'm reminded of something Alexander Hamilton wrote in 1784. He wrote something to the effect that if our public councils treat their responsibilities as sport, we will then end up with a government that is distracted, feeble, and arbitrary. And I know as a military officer, I took my responsibilities very, very seriously, whether that be in Iraq and Afghanistan, or teaching cadets in the classroom, or serving multiple administrations in the White House. Took it very, very seriously because I believed that was my duty, and the American people expected and deserve that. I would challenge our political leaders, or perhaps our political officers in leadership roles, to be leaders and not to treat their responsibilities as sport, but recognize what they say and what they do does affect American lives. And for those two gentlemen that we're deciding on next week, their decisions will affect billions of lives, and none of that should be taken as a sport. And maybe I'm naive in the world of politics, but I think that's what the American people deserve. And I think it's sad that they don't expect that anymore. I think they expect their politicians to be sporty and play the bloodbath game. And we're going to watch election night I mean, at the beginning, I described watching election night 2016 as watching like set up like a Super Bowl. So it already in our mind, it's already embedded that it's some sort of sport. I think we need to escape that and recognize that what the purpose of government is and government leaders, what their real roles are. And as a people, we deserve that.
Fair enough. So Jason, let's get to the last question here. You were talking the other day about the possibility of a really weird outcome in the Electoral College. The possibilities that states could send potentially multiple sets of electors to the Electoral College, and the technical possibility that we could have a Trump-Harris or a Biden-Pence administration, actually have a mixed administration. Is that actually possible? Is that something that realistically could happen? And if it did, would that be so bad?
So yeah, I think it is possible, right? I think it's possible. The likelihood of it happening is rather low. But as I understand it, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer or constitutional law professor, but as I have done my research on this, that is a possibility, and it really comes down to how the electors are handled. To your point, if states send multiple electors, this is where we start getting into a constitutional crisis. And I think there's only been one tie in the Electoral College. There is a possibility that we get a 269 and 269 electoral tie. Then there's also possibilities where you get, and I don't understand all of this aspect, but the faithless elector, where the electors don't adhere to what their state wants.
Right.
So there's a variety of combinations that could lead to, whatever comes out November 3rd, when the electors meet on December 14th. So on December 14th, the electors meet each of their states, and they will cast their ballots. And then on January 3rd, the new Congress will enter into office. We'll all take their oath. And then on January 6th, the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate will certify the election. And that's where, from my understanding, where things can get a bit dicey, because if you have multiple electors, and it's really, I think, the states that have a Republican-controlled legislative branch and a Democratic governor, they could send multiple electors representing or voting for Trump and Biden, respectively. And then when these states, when it comes to the House of Representatives, would, in a contested election going to at this level, the House of Representatives would choose the president, the Senate would choose the vice president, and of course, the House and Senate could flip in this next administration and in the next Congress. But let's suppose for the moment that the House, it's interesting about the House because it's not, because the Democrats control the House, but in this situation, when they have to go to a contingent election in the House, voting for president, each state has one vote. Right. So California and Wyoming have an equal vote.
Right.
If we count the state delegations, there's 26 Republican delegations, 23 Democrat delegations, and then there's one that's divided. So if Congress remains the same, just for the sake of argument, the House would vote for president, and Republicans would control that, and they would vote a Donald Trump. So you have Trump as president being inaugurated 2 weeks later on January 20th. The Senate would choose the vice president. And as I understand this to work out, it could be the case that certainly the Republicans control the Senate now, but there is a weird way that even if they were to hold on the majority, you would have no president, you wouldn't have a vice president come January 20th,
right?
Because Vice President Pence time would expire. You would have no president, so you have no, especially if the House remains contested, you could have a case where you could have an acting Nancy Pelosi, acting Speaker of the House, or Speaker of the House being acting president, And when all the dust settles, it ends up with a President Trump and a Vice President Harris. I don't explain that very well because, again, I'm not a lawyer, but there's these convoluted ways where that could happen. And then to your last point, I mean, would it be bad to have a split president and vice president? You know, we tried to fix that previously, I think in the 12th Amendment, but it's interesting. A Trump-Harris or a Biden-Pence would certainly, I think in the year 2020, I think we've come to learn that anything is possible and we should expect the unexpected. But I don't know. It certainly will be interesting. I mean, we'll know more a week from now.
Right. All right. Well, Jason, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation, for just being so straightforward, your honesty on all of this. Thank you again for your service to the United States. And we're really glad to have you on the Board of Advisors for Deep Knowledge Investing. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Well, Gary, thank you. And again, I apologize for the technical issues and for those that had to drop off, but hopefully folks are able to catch some of this. And if anybody has any follow-on questions, I'm always happy to share my observations and experiences so that people are more informed. So thank you, Gary, for having me today. And I look forward to future conversations.
Great. Thanks, Jason.